In firm support of the principle that no child should be left behind, side proposition will bring you three arguments. First of all, that private institutions, educational institutions, entrench social inequality. Second of all, that the state cannot leave the future of our children in the hands of profit-making corporations. And third of all, my second speaker will tell you that private educational institutions compromise on the quality of our education. But before moving into our case, a few definitions. Private education refers to schools all the way from preschool to tertiary institutions, which are owned and run by private profit-making corporations or religious groups. They have two key characteristics. First of all, they are fee-paying. Students pay their own fees to go there, and these fees tend to be significantly higher than those that students pay for public institutions. Second of all, these institutions have almost complete autonomy to determine their own curriculum, their staffing, and their facilities. Let's move into our model for today. We will gradually nationalize all private educational institutions, moving towards a system of free and universal education for all who qualify. Second of all, we would have a national curriculum to which all schools' curricula must be aligned. We say that individual schools can have some leeway as to how to implement this curricula, for example, changing their pedagogy to cater to different needs, but fundamentally, they must meet the standards of our nationalized curricula. We have a clear track record of success in Finland, where universal free education has produced students consistently ranked #1 amongst the OECD nations in terms of literacy and numeracy. Having said that, let me move into my first argument about how their policy entrenches social inequality. We begin from the simple premise that the state makes things illegal when they inflict grievous harms upon the fundamental values of our society. And one of those fundamental values is that of egalitarianism. Regardless of whether you're born into a rich or poor family, everyone deserves an equal starting point. This argument stems from the basic idea of the birth lottery. Where we are born, whether we are born into a rich or a poor family, that is purely morally arbitrary. We exercise no consent, nor any choice in the matter. Still, whether we're born into the different circumstances into which we are born affect the kinds of opportunities we get in life. And I'll be explaining how this applies to education later. But the ultimate endpoint of this argument is that the state must step in to mitigate the effects of this morally arbitrary birth lottery. And that is why the principle of egalitarianism is fundamental. That is why the state must ensure that education acts as a social leveler. It must make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity in life and is exposed, therefore, to the same educational opportunities that can give them a better shot at life in future. So, how does private education hurt the concept of social equality, and egalitarianism? We see that private educational institutions promote a vicious cycle where rich students get the better opportunities and poor students are left out. This vicious cycle starts when richer students pay exorbitant fees to enter into institutions like Winchester, like Eton, like Dragon. What happens then is that they are exposed, hold on a moment sir, into a system which eventually results into better access to top universities and top opportunities later on in the workforce. But before I explain how, yes?
Now, how do you propose that abolishing these institutions will make it any better for the poor, unequal students to get any better educations?
You clearly haven't been listening to our model. We are not abolishing these institutions, we are moving towards a system where all these institutions are public, and we move towards a system of free and universal education. Clearly, that point is irrelevant. So how exactly are students in these institutions exposed to a system which eventually gives them better opportunities? There are several ways in which this happens. First of all, these institutions have links to examination boards and are therefore able to drill their students in advance for questions that may come out in later examinations. This is why in Korea, private institutions are able to drill their students time and again on the questions that are going to come out in key examinations, therefore preparing them better for entrance into university. But further than that, these students are given a brand name which no other students have, which no other schools have. They are therefore given an advantage over other students regardless of their results. It doesn't matter whether you get D's and E's, because if you come from Eton, you'll be able to get into Yale, and if you come from Yale, you'll be able to get a job in whichever company that you want, because you have that brand name, no. But these things are more insidious than that. The alumni of these private educational institutions permeate all aspects of our life. These old boys networks consist of top businessmen, politicians, and lawyers who maintain links with these universities. They then use their connections to ensure that their juniors have no problems getting better opportunities in life. If you're from Oxford, even if you graduate in biology, you have a much better chance of making it into, for example, a law firm, because your alumni and your seniors are there to maintain those connections and give you the opportunities, making sure that the road ahead of you is paved with gold. They're going to come back to us and talk about scholarships and how they're so effective in giving students opportunities. We say scholarships are a tokenistic measure. Why? Because institutions like universities are not accountable to taxpayers. Rather, they are accountable to shareholders and owners who have profit motives. This means that they are incentivized to promote policies which give them the most money, rather than promote policies which benefit the most deserving, but those who are poor. Even those who get scholarships have a hard time in universities, because often they are segregated. For example, in Eton, the scholarship holders wear different caps and go to different dormitories than other students. This is why 80% of Oxbridge students are come from private institutions like Dragon, Winchester, and Eton, while these institutions only account for 15% of the population. The vicious cycle is then completed when these private institutions use the amassed resources from the exorbitant fees that students pay to maintain these institutional links with their alumni, as well as to keep out poorer students, because these poor students just can't afford to pay to get into these institutions. What results is the segregation between the rich and the poor and decreased social mobility. And we must use the instrument of the law to protect this, because it violates the fundamental principle of egalitarianism. With that, I'll move into my second argument about how we cannot leave the future of our children into private profit-making corporations. We'd like to draw a parallel here to state-provided free vaccinations. The state cannot afford to let citizens take the risk of getting polio or diseases like that in future. It must therefore exercise its own discretion to make sure that every single child, every single person gets vaccinated against these diseases. Similarly, education must be of quality and consistency to ensure that students have a bright future, and to make sure that institutions don't compromise on quality. The problem is that private institutions do actually tend to do this and compromise on quality and inconsistency. Why? Because students in private institutions tend to be exposed only to their own socio-economic strata, meaning that they don't have the sense of civic consciousness that is necessary for people who go out into the workforce and into the world and interact with other people. But further to that, they tend to instill values which are against those of society. For example, a school for Latter-day Saints in America didn't teach evolution, the Big Bang Theory, and most of biology, meaning that students didn't have a fundamental understanding of science. Regulations don't work in this situation because of the idea of regulatory capture. Old boys in top ranks control regulatory bodies, meaning that the state cannot protect these private institutions from these harms. And it is for all these reasons that our side stands for the children who cannot make it into these private institutions.
Ladies and gentlemen, optimism. What makes Columbia College a Columbia College? Does it the government or the $60,000 that the education has been provided, which the people pay for it? We say the proposition is actually wrong. We say in both cases of the situation, the people are going to be hurt because of the quality of education, which is going to be significantly lowered by the side proposition. We justified imbalance, disparity, and such, Madam Speaker, with one condition. We say that it is of course bad we do not have imbalance, but imbalance is justified, Madam Speaker, in cases. We say side proposition is giving one bread for the poor and one bread for the rich. While we say that, Madam Speaker, yes, the poor is getting significantly less starting at the rates, but, Madam Speaker, at the end of the day, still these people are going to be, for example, 2 bread for the poor and 5 bread for the rich, and that is going to be our motto. But before all that, 3 points of rebuttal. Firstly, about the scholarships, they talk about how it's bad and such for the people. Well, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, but if you're coming from a very bad place, if you do not have any money, then you're probably not going to care about the discrimination that you're going to face about Eton. You're not probably going to care about the fact that you're going to a different dormitory. We believe that is up to the free will of the individuals, and that's why there's another problem. And most of the cases, Mr. Speaker, like in the case of Robert College, where people do provide to the 25% scholarship for the people who are less fortunate than us, Madam Speaker, we said in these cases the people are actually benefit, and we are able to give the who are very successful, who are very educated, and such, Madam Speaker, we can give these people scholarships and provide a much better education than that proposition. We say even if it's a better, we say our education is best for the people who have talked about. Now let's get to the second idea, social equality. We don't think that they necessarily do provide a social equality to begin with. The schools does not necessarily have to provide a social equality. We say that yes, in the schools you may be providing this, but more importantly, we thought that this is not the case. But more importantly, Madam Speaker, outside of school, it is not going to work like that. They talk about the network connections. We say that a rich person has probably have much more connections outside the school. If he has a very wealthy parent from the company that he's working in, from the environment that that person is hanging out, they're probably going to have much more connections than the school has. And in their system, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, there's probably much more connections to begin with. And lastly, Madam Speaker, the poor they talk about how they're going to be able to help the poor kid. Well, Madam Speaker, the poor kid is going to probably work for 8 hours after the school in order to be providing for himself, while the rich kids are probably going to have better relations, but more importantly, will have better books, more access to technology, and that's why have much better chances than the side that proposition has spoken about. In that case, we do not necessarily believe that equality is going to be provided for in either case. And lastly, they talk about how the private schools are inconsistent to begin with. Well, Madam Speaker, this argument is not against private education, but it's against weak regulations. So we say that, Madam Speaker, in that case, we can actually make the regulations much better, which means we can punish these schools much worse, and that's why these people will be deterred. This is a sincere manipulation on our proposition to begin with. Now, let me show you our constructive case, which is much more important in this debate. We also agree in most of the principles that team proposition is talking about. However, we believe that, Madam Speaker, this side proposition is only going to exacerbate the problem. We have that significant amount of people go to private education. For example, in the case of United States of America, roughly 35%. While on the whole world, Madam Speaker, 10 or 20%, which is a very huge number. And we already know that the public education is not really that great to begin with. These people live in very crowded classrooms, very bad equipment, no access to technology, and underpaid and demotivated teachers to begin with. So we say the current situation in these kind of schools are already terrible to begin with. We said that there are 2 problems with their case. Firstly, Madam Speaker, the private education does imply a huge number of tax revenues for the government. We say that, for example, you pay $60,000 for the Columbia College so that you can get into that college. We say this is a very huge amount of numbers, and there's a huge number of people who just contribute to these private colleges. In that case, Madam Speaker, there's a huge amount of money that is paid for the government, and we say that this is much more useful for the people because of the fact that, Madam Speaker, the government directly supports the private education, public education by the tax revenues that it has. But why we say that, Madam Speaker, with the private education, you're already able to contribute more to the private public education by providing with more taxes, more services, much more paid teachers, and less crowded classrooms. But this is not the most important issue. The main problem is that, Madam Speaker, you do not only have less money, but you already have to provide much more for much more people. The question is this, Madam Speaker, is the X amount of money divided by the 60% of the population or the 100% of the population is going to be profitable for the public education? We believe that is the most important question of this debate. We say that, Madam Speaker, if we cram more people into classrooms which are already crowded, if we provide less technology and less materials because we are not able to do so, we say that the situation is going to only get worse, Madam Speaker, in the public education. And we say that, Madam Speaker, not only the private education, people who are coming from the private education is going to get worse, but also, Madam Speaker, also the public education is also going to get significantly worse because of this. And that is the reason why, Madam Speaker, we say that this is a very terrible idea. The side proposition is only making the situation worse for the people just because to make equality. We say equality is less important than the situation of the poor people, the situation of the public education. And in that case, Madam Speaker, we say this is only a bad idea. Yes, go.
Demonizing public education isn't this debate. It has worked before in Finland. It will work again if we improve it. The solution is
if we improve it, well, ladies and gentlemen, currently it is not improved, but even if you improve, even if it's much better, still, Madam Speaker, we say that X amount of money divided by a much less amount of people is still going to provide much more benefit, much more technology, much more teachers, much more material for the people, and that's why much more education is going to be provided by the public education, Madam Speaker. That's a sincere manipulation by side proposition to begin with. So in that case, Mr. Speaker, what happens in their situation? An average classroom of 41 in the United States of America directly rises to 50, 60, and that is why the education is going to get probably much worse, because for example, we believe that teacher education and also attention is probably much more important than in the system of education. If this gets less, Madam Speaker, the much less amount of education is probably going to be given to the people, and that's why we believe side proposition is only exacerbating the problem. Yeah, we believe that private education is better than the other cases, but Madam Speaker, side proposition does not only hinder the private students, but also hinder the situation of the public government schools, and which is a very bad idea. Let's get the higher chance of raising, the equality idea. We believe, Madam Speaker, this equality idea is a higher chance of raising is much better on side opposition because of one single idea, Madam Speaker. Because these people have a significantly better education to begin with. Yes, they have equality, but every single person has a much worse education, which is a bad idea, Madam Speaker. In our case, since these people have significantly better education, they have significant better idea and probability of getting higher in society. And that's why, Madam Speaker, we believe it's a probable option to begin with, and that's why team proposition is only exacerbating the problem. So what we have told you today, firstly, equality and disparity is justified if we are able to provide both of the parties much more amount of goods, in this case much more amount of education, which was justified in our case, Madam Speaker. But secondly, we told that the situation is not that desperate. There are still the scholarships, and we already told that, Madam Speaker, this is going to be a huge detriment to the budget, and that's why the public education is only going to get worse. That's why go with prop up.
Liberty, equality, solidarity. That is the rallying cry of Team Raffles today. I'm going to ask two questions. One, is private education just? And two, does it improve the quality of education? The answer to both questions is a resounding no. First point, on justice. And here, we are an opposition that tried to justify inequality.
by saying that even though a rich kid may have 5 pieces of bread and a poor kid may have 2 pieces of bread, it's okay because they all have something to eat. We fundamentally reject this analysis because we're not talking about how many pieces of bread you have. We are talking about your opportunities in life, the type of salary that you're going to be earning at the age of 40 or 50, the type of universities that you're going to be able to go to, the type of access to political opportunities that you will have in your adult life. And we think that it's fundamentally abhorrent that we have an opposition that attempts to justify such equality. Because even if we accept that private education is somehow of a higher quality, we think that the point is rendered irrelevant if the vast majority of people in our nation do not have access to such high quality education. This point clearly falls to outside of the house. Next, they try to tell us that equality was natural, and even if we were to make private education illegal, we are not going to resolve this problem. Sure, we recognize that kids who come from rich families may still have more books, they may have access to computers at home. But that doesn't mean that we should not do our utmost in order to resolve these pre-existing disparities in society, precisely because they arise from morally arbitrary circumstances. Finally, they talk to us about scholarships and how it's okay that kids are discriminated against even though they go to private schools. Now, first and foremost, they have already considered that only the minority of students from lower economic classes have access to private schools. But more importantly, we also think it's abhorrent that these private educational institutions are so elitist to the extent that they will shut out anyone who doesn't come from their own kind. As a consequence, we say that the side of justice clearly stands on our side of the house. Next, let's ask ourselves, no, thank you sir, does private education actually improve the quality of our education? My first speaker brought you argumentation about how the future of our children is so fundamental that we can take no risk and must err on the side of caution. Team Opposition had a one-word response: regulation. To which we have explained that regulation in the field of education systemically fails because of regulatory capture. Why? Let's think about it. Who qualifies to be a regulator? You need to be an expert in the field of education with qualifications and degrees. And the problem with private schools is that they are able to pay the higher salaries and attract these individuals into their ranks, creating a close and insidious network between regulators and private educational institutions that prevents effective regulation. No, thank you, sir. Clearly, regulation is an insufficient safeguard. Next, Team Opposition said that they were prepared to sacrifice the future of our nation, no, thank you, in the interest of tax revenue. And that somehow the tax revenue that comes from private schools will be able to fund the education of the rest of our people. We have a couple of responses to this. First of all, we don't actually get that much tax revenue from private educational institutions because very often they masquerade behind the hue of being a charity or a non-profit organization, and as such are tax exempt. That's why donations to places like Eton are not subject to taxation. Clearly, the tax revenue they talk about doesn't even exist. No, thank you. But more importantly, we said that there are a whole range of other means that the state can gain the revenue to fund public education. For instance, by raising the level of income tax. We don't think that sacrificing our children in the interest of earning more revenue is ever justified. Hold on a moment, sir. Last but not least, they told us that public education is creaking and that it's so bad that we are going to decrease the quality of education of everyone. But before I take down that analysis, yes, sir.
And is the state really unable to increase income tax without actually abolishing these private institutions in the first place?
No, the point that we are trying to make is that in exchange for abolishing private educational institutions and substituting it with publicly funded education, we can raise income tax, and hence there is no feasibility issue with our model. Clearly, quality is not compromised. But now let's address their fallacious claim that public education is so bad that it's going to decrease the quality of education of everyone. And here I'm going to transition to my constructive argument, where I'm going to continue clashing with their constructive material. So my first layer of analysis is going to show you that in the status quo, there's no incentive for the state to improve the quality of education. Why is this the case, ladies and gentlemen? Let's think about it. Who are the policy makers and decision makers in our society? They inevitably hail from the higher socio-economic structures within our nation. As a consequence, what this means is that it's these same people who graduated from private educational institutions and these same people who send their children to private schools. As a consequence of that, it's often impossible for these individuals to relate with and empathize with the plight of a student in a public school. And that's why even if you have more tax revenue, the changes and reforms they propose are not going to happen. We have seen this with instances like Ed Balls, the Shadow Chancellor for Education in Britain, no thank you, who declared that school children should stop whining about cold lunches. Ladies and gentlemen, it was patently obvious that he had never had any sense of what it meant to have to put out 6 hours of lessons a day in an overcrowded classroom and then having to have substandard meal. As a consequence, we said that the only way to redress this is to create a sense of solidarity by making public education illegal. But more importantly, I'm going to demonstrate to you that currently the presence of private education prevents improvements and reforms to public education. Why is this the case, ladies and gentlemen? What are the ingredients that we need in order to reform public education? We need better teachers, and we need better experts to set our curriculum. And the problem with the status quo, hold on a moment, sir, is that public schools, which have the resource, private schools that have the resources to amass huge amounts of wealth, are accumulating all this talent. As a consequence, the teachers who remain in the public system are often of a lower quality. What do you have to say to that, sir?
Ladies and gentlemen, we ask one question. If we ask people whether they would choose equal education or would they choose more education, what do you think these people would choose?
Well, if you are the 90% who cannot afford the high quality education you speak of, then I pretty much think that you are going to choose to have more education. But more importantly, I'm showing you right now as to why the quality of education under your paradigm is compromised as well. So clearly, you have not been listening to my point. So the next link in my argument is that even if you are to accept that the quality of private education and public education are on par, we say that even private schools often do not meet the standards we want. Why is this the case, ladies and gentlemen? Because a good education is not just about getting A's or having good results. It's also being about expose the diversity of individuals out there. A doctor whose only friends are those who hail from terrorist flats is inevitably worse off in understanding his patients. A lawyer who cannot comprehend what it means to live in a slum inevitably finds it harder to defend a defendant who comes from a lower socioeconomic class. For all these reasons, we say that it's our side that is just, but even if we accept their claim that equality can be sacrificed for quality, we still take this debate.
Thank you very much. Now please welcome the second opposition speaker to accept their argument.
Today, we believe it's justifiable to have unequal distribution of breads if everyone is receiving more bread to eat, if everyone has a full stomach in the night. We say that through the existence of private education, we provide these people with less crowded classrooms. Secondly, we provide these people with more tax revenues through the private education, through buying of textbooks, through giving salaries to the teachers. We say most of the private schools are not charities, and this was a lie that was brought up by Team Proposition. We believe that if we ask people if they would prefer equal quality of education or if they would prefer better quality of education, we say that everyone is inherently going to choose better quality of education, and since that it is more beneficial for their own life, for their own education, and for their own standards. We say that in team opposition's case, we provide both the people who can afford private schools with better quality of education, and we can provide the majority of the people who go to public schools with a much better quality of education, and that's why we say we are justified to do this. Ladies and gentlemen, today I have 3 main points of rebuttal, and after that I will present you my argument about unjustification, how it's unjustifiable to ban private education. Firstly, let's examine their point about how private education institutes actually decrease the quality of education. Firstly, we say if they were under quality as they are offering us, we say that people would not be choosing it in the first place. We believe these private education institutes are offering more than what public schools offer. And secondly, we say that all these money that's going to public schools, actually, no thank you, provides the students with better technology, better textbooks, better teachers, better extracurricular activities, and we say that these classrooms are not crowded, and we say that furthermore, the classrooms in the public schools are as well much less crowded, and the people have much more facilities for themselves. We say that, on the other hand, no, thank you, you have lower taxes due to the abolishment of private education. And secondly, we say that you have much more crowded classrooms with an additional students who come from the private schools. And thirdly, we say that the good quality is not present. And we say that you actually disadvantage the children who cannot provide for private schools. How? Let's examine this. We say that if a poor and a rich kid both graduate from a mediocre government school, we say that rich is going to be advantageous. However, ladies and gentlemen, in our system, we have scholarships. We have offers for these bright students even if they don't have money, and we see that when we offer them with scholarships into good education facilities, these people have the chance to shine. No, thank you. These people have the chance to shine when the other kid can't make it into a Yale, for example, and we see that these people now have the chance to shine. Furthermore, you told us that how the government did not have any incentive for the improvement of government public schools. However, we say that still educated people are really important for our community, and the government will actually, this is a great incentive for the government to provide better quality of public education. Secondly, we say that the majority of our people who, no thank you, go to these public education facilities, and that's why for the happiness of the majority, the government actually has to provide this, because this is the main aim of the government as the state. And furthermore, we say the quality of education which the government actually has the incentive for is higher when the existence of private schools is present. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to move on with my argument, but before that I can take any points if you have one. Okay, now I will move on with my arguments, which is about how unjustifiable is it to ban private education. Equality of opportunity. Decreasing the imbalance in society may be good morals to impose. Yes, we agree with that. However, we say decreasing the quality of opportunities that are offered make these morals unjustifiable, since they do not provide with more benefits, as we told you in my rebuttals and as my first speaker told you. And since we do not provide these people with happiness, we say these morals are unjustifiable when they do more harm than good. Ladies and gentlemen, the inequality between the private and public schools is caused by the government and should be improved by the government, not through the limitation of people's freedom to choose about their children's education.
Information, madam.
I will take you in a second, sir. And it should not be provided through making everyone's education quality far worse, significantly worse. Wouldn't you agree?
Can you please deal with the fact that people who provide scholarships are beholden to shareholders, therefore don't have an incentive to give scholarships to those who deserve it per our poor?
Okay, thank you. That's the point. We say scholarships are good for these people if they want social mobility. We say scholarships are actually beneficial, and we see no harm if these people are going to receive better educations in the end. If these people are going to go to Yale, if these people are going to graduate from Harvard, this is actually beneficial for those students, and we see no harm in our system. Now I would like to move on. Thank you. As I told you, the existence of private schools actually provide the people the freedom to choose. For example, if a parent wants to invest in their kids' education, which is much more higher quality in private schools, we say that these people should have the ability to choose. These people should have the ability to invest in their children's education because if this is what will make them happier in their lives. And we said that we can't make these people unhappy because we wouldn't be justified to make these people unhappy because they have 4 major benefits to our society. Firstly, we say that they pay taxes for other children's education and they do no harm to those students in the first place who go to the public schools. No, thank you. Secondly, we say that they decrease the burden on the government to by providing more facilities for these children, and we say that the public education is doing far better in their system, in the system. Thirdly, we say that they provide more taxes through private education sector. And fourthly, we say as these people graduate from better schools, as these people graduate from high quality schools, these people do more good to the society. A graduate from MIT, a graduate from Harvard, for example, actually does better for the society rather than a graduate from a mediocre university or mediocre government school. And we say that these practical benefits go for side opposition. And we say that principles are invalid when both sides are hurt. Let's look at how the other side of the coin is hurt in this situation. We said that these people who go to public schools are going to receive education in much more crowded classrooms. Secondly, we said that these people will have less budget for their schools because now the tax revenues coming from private education sector is decreased, and we say that there are more students to share this tax revenue. And thirdly, we say that no scholarship opportunities or whatsoever are there for them to shine in their lives, are there for them to pass other students who could provide themselves with private schools. And we say that when everyone is in a worse condition, this does not provide any good to the society. When there are people who have a good quality of education and who are much better in life, we say this system is justifiable. Our system is more justifiable, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Now it's time for third speeches. I welcome the third proposition speaker.
No child should be left behind. That is a base principle of side proposition throughout this debate. Now let's look at the 2 main issues of today's debate. Firstly, which side ensures equality? Secondly, which side ensures quality of education? The answer to both these questions is Team Raffles. So firstly, on the issue of which side better protects equality in education. Now we see a side that's willing to be clearly flippant about these issues, to draw ridiculous analogies to have giving everyone bread and comparing education to something as simple as that. We tell you that education isn't about that. Education is a mechanism through which we level the inequalities inherent within our society. It isn't sufficient for side opposition to tell us that inequalities always exist. Side proposition is realistic enough to understand that people from richer backgrounds may have some benefits in life. That doesn't mean that as a government, we should not do everything within our power to level the playing field as much as possible. And we think a crucial way through which we do this is to ensure equal opportunities in education, since the education you receive is so fundamental to your life, to what university you go to, and what kind of job opportunities you get in later life. This is precisely why equality is important in this debate. Side opposition throws around words like scholarships and regulations and tells us that these are sufficient. So firstly, on the issue of scholarships, we took you down by telling you that private institutions have no incentive to offer scholarships simply because they are profit-motivated enterprises and therefore would not see an incentive in offering scholarships to poorer but deserving students. Secondly, we told you that even when these scholarships are offered, they are merely tokenistic public relations gestures, and these students get immensely discriminated within these institutions. Now, let's not be flippant about these once again. We think it's fundamentally abhorrent that we can live in a society where rich children can think that just because they happen to be born rich, they can deride and insult those poorer children as charity cases. This isn't a society that we want to live in. This is why scholarships fail. The second issue that they brought up is the issue of regulations and how they work. Now, we brought up in both speakers the issue of regulatory captures, how they have insidious networks within these educational regulatory bodies, which allows them to influence their mechanisms and processes, making them inherently corrupt. Now, I give you an example of how in the United Kingdom, private institutions collaborated together to price fixes very high to prevent poor students from entering these institutions. Within the United Kingdom, there are regulatory bodies, but all these failed because the regulatory bodies were staffed by old boys. The old boy networks is deeply insidious and runs through every facet of society. This is precisely why, no thank you sir, precisely why private institutions in the United Kingdom have close ties with universities like Oxford and Cambridge, giving students who enter these institutions a road paved with gold throughout later life. They have more political opportunities when they enter the political sphere. They have more opportunities in work. They tell us that these opportunities will always exist even in our model because rich children will have richer parents who have closer connections to these bodies. Now we think that old boys make these problems even worse because when these old boys go into the workplace and get these opportunities, their incentive isn't to help everyone in society, but their incentive is to try and pull each other up to ensure that their juniors get the same opportunities that they do. This is precisely why many political institutions such as Japan, many corporations within Japan are fully funded and staffed by people from private institutions. This is a disturbing trend in our society, especially when you consider the fact that people in political positions of power should be people who are able to look at society as a whole, not people who think that poor people are essentially aliens, people who have never been able to interact with those who are on a lower socio-economic strata. This isn't a society that we want to live in. Wouldn't you agree, sir?
Are you aware of the fact that the majority of the population is in those public education, and that's why the people have to invest in these kind of areas in order to gain votes from these people?
The majority of the population is in public education, but like you pointed out, they're in public education that is creaking and poor. This is because of the issue in which the people in power do not see an incentive to improve public education systems. To tell us that they need to improve public education systems in order to win elections simply isn't sufficient. Because the elections are multi-issue, and therefore they know that public education is not the only thing that is going to swing elections, therefore they are comfortable with compromising on it. They give us this analysis on how we need to ensure freedom of choice, that parents need to allow their kids to go to higher quality educational institutes. No, we don't think that this is the case. When it comes to something as fundamental as education, we don't think that richer parents can give their kids a push-up in life by sending them to educational institutions that gives them so many opportunities above poorer children. Clearly, equality is an issue that they completely dismiss in their case, and we challenge your third speaker to prove to us why equality is irrelevant to them. So moving on to the next issue of quality. Now we have a side opposition that tells us about how tax revenues from private institutions can then be used to fund the public education system. They tell us how public education is creaking, it's old. And we say that the solution to this is to improve public education infrastructure, is not to exacerbate this divide. We told you about how the issue of tax revenues doesn't really work. While we acknowledge that most of these institutions that run private educational institutions are actually profit-making mechanisms, they manage to masquerade as charities because they provide education. This allows them to exploit tax revenue loopholes, and therefore they do not provide much to society as a whole. Secondly, we see that private institutions are able to pay their teachers extremely high salaries. Therefore, they attract the best and brightest from the educational institutions across the country and ensure that the best teachers go to private institutions. This is precisely why talented teachers in public institutions are few and far between. This is a problem that we see. So clearly, the issue of using tax revenues to improve public education doesn't work. What will truly improve public education is when you raise income taxes, as we've seen in the model, hold on a moment, sir, we've seen in the model of nations like Finland, increase income tax for everyone and ensure that everyone goes to a public institution. So clearly, the issue of how they masquerade tax revenues as a panacea to the problems in public education clearly doesn't work. Whereas in our case, we bring you a comparative in which talented teachers go to schools all across the country. They are not only attracted to a certain type of institutions, and therefore people on the poorer end of the spectrum are not disadvantaged. We tell you that tax revenues don't work because of so many problems inherent within the system. So clearly, we prove to you that we are the side that ensure the quality of the education system. As our second speaker already put forth to you, we clearly provide an incentive for policymakers to care about these public institutions because it's their children who are going to be studying in them, rather than them thinking as public institutions as something irrelevant to them because public institutions are for the poor. That isn't a society that we want to live in. So clearly in today's debate, we are the side that provides the equality of education, we are the side that provides the quality of education, and we are the side that ensure that no child ever gets left behind. Therefore, I beg you to walk with side proposition.
Thank you very much. Now I call on the third opposition speaker on that.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us first make a few things clear. We agree with side proposition that in fact the quality of education is important. And we agree that social inequality is in fact a bad thing, ladies and gentlemen. But what we don't agree upon is the fact that their model, ladies and gentlemen, and this motion will in fact make these things better, ladies and gentlemen. We don't believe that this will, and this does lead us to our clash points, which are, firstly, ladies and gentlemen, will the quality of education really increase under this model, ladies and gentlemen? Side opposition seems to think not. And will social equality really be sustained, ladies and gentlemen, if this model passes? Again, no, ladies and gentlemen, this will not happen. And with that, let me move on to my first point, which is the quality of education, of course. Team Proposition comes up and says the quality of education will increase if we actually make these institutions all public, ladies and gentlemen. But we beg to differ. The quality of education actually decreases when, in fact, ladies and gentlemen, all parties are forced to work under the same mediocre education, ladies and gentlemen. There's no top-tier university, there's no top-tier area, ladies and gentlemen, to which these students can go. All of these educational institutions, ladies and gentlemen, are mediocre, and therefore, even the best ones, ladies and gentlemen, are not comparable to those of private institutions. No, thank you, sir. No, thank you, sir. So, ladies and gentlemen, in fact, we can see here that the fact that once these tax revenues collected, ladies and gentlemen, from the private institutions are abolished, we can see that, in fact, there will be much less spending towards these public institutions from the government in the first place. So the government won't even be able to sustain proper expenditure towards these institutions, therefore leading to them to be mediocre and not quite in the same standard as those of private institutions. And ladies and gentlemen, even if the top ones were there, even if the top public institutions were good enough, ladies and gentlemen, I'll explain to you in a few points why, in fact, these top institutions won't even be shared by the poor citizens or the poor students that you're talking about in the first place. But before that, the point of social inequality. Now, they talk about social inequality as if it will not continue to exist when this motion is passed, ladies and gentlemen. Do you really think that once the rich people are still forced to go to public schools, they will not actually attain better places, ladies and gentlemen? Of course they will. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Simply because of the advantages they have of being affluent and being wealthy, ladies and gentlemen. Such as, ladies and gentlemen, peripheral educational systems like textbooks and better connections with educational figures, ladies and gentlemen. Better connections with important educational figures as well as peripheral access to better educational systems actually gives these people a major advantage. And therefore, what we will see that will happen when this motion is passed, ladies and gentlemen, is that most of the people, most of the affluent people, will actually be going to the top public schools in the first place, simply because they have better connections as well as better access to most educational systems, ladies and gentlemen. And because of this, in fact, there still will be segregation, unlike what Team Proposition is proposing, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. And because the poor actually have to work for their families, actually have to work besides education, and because education isn't their main concern, because they have other much bigger problems such as staying alive or even actually being able to support their families, they will not even be in the same category, ladies and gentlemen. So the rich will, no, thank you, sir. The rich will still have the major advantage here, ladies and gentlemen. And you're also telling us how you will mitigate the effects of arbitrary selection, ladies and gentlemen. But like we've just said, this will not happen, ladies and gentlemen, because you're letting the affluent students still go to the top public schools, even though they are public, and you're not allowing any scholarships to these people in the first place. So the ones who could have actually gone to private institutions, ladies and gentlemen, will not be able to in the first place. They will not even have better access, and they will be pushed into mediocre schools, ladies and gentlemen, and they will, of course, be crammed with both the rich and the poor, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, there still will be segregation, which is our next point, ladies and gentlemen. Team Proposition seems to think that segregation will cease to exist once this motion is passed, but of course it will not. It's not for the point that I just told you, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that the rich people will still be in the same environment as these people will, of course, lead to a certain segregation. These people will still notice that these people have much better access to much better things, ladies and gentlemen, and much more services in general. They'll notice that, of course, there is a segregation and polarization of the people in these schools in the first place. But whereas with private schools, ladies and gentlemen, when all the rich people, or the majority of the rich people can go to private schools, there isn't segregation because the less fortunate people have the ability to go to public schools and they have the ability to form the majority there. Whereas in your scenario, this doesn't even happen. So segregation continues to exist. In fact, is exacerbated in Proposition's model, ladies and gentlemen. But moving on. Now, you also talk about how income tax actually can be used to increase the quality of public education. But ladies and gentlemen, can you really not increase income tax without abolishing private education? Of course you can. It's still possible to increase income tax while still keeping the private institutions, which will only add to the tax generated, ladies and gentlemen, will only add to the revenue collected in order to help these government public schools, in order to help government expenditure actually affect these public schools in the first place. So we can still bring about income tax, as Proposition supposes, but we don't have to abolish private institutions to do this, because in fact, private institutions have their own tax, ladies and gentlemen, which I will move on to in a later point. But before that, ladies and gentlemen, the idea that the curriculum should be nationalized. Well, we're telling you that the curriculum is already nationalized simply because of the moderation. And of course, Team Proposition came up with the idea that moderation is insufficient and that moderation is actually connected to private institutions. But no, moderation is connected to the central government and the governmental organization. So in other words, unless you're saying that the government is corrupt, then of course moderation is not corrupt either. If the government is corrupt, how on earth do you think that public schools will be benefiting the people in the first place? If the government is corrupt, as Team Proposition seems to propose, ladies and gentlemen, of course these public institutions won't even benefit in the first place. But moving on, ladies and gentlemen, you're also talking about profit-motivated enterprises, which I've also talked about before. Now, even if these enterprises or corporations are profit-motivated, they still offer a certain amount of tax revenue, and they still offer a certain amount of tax revenue that goes to public schools and goes to improve public education, ladies and gentlemen. So despite them being profit-driven, ladies and gentlemen, they still offer a significant amount of money money to these public education, and of course, this betters public education for everyone, ladies and gentlemen. And what Team Proposition is saying is that we should remove this, and that we should remove the benefits that these schools have just because they are profit-driven, ladies and gentlemen, and this is ridiculous. You're also telling us that public schools will not be cared for if private ones exist. But is that the reality, ladies and gentlemen? When public schools constitute 60% of the population, students, ladies and gentlemen, we can see that in fact the government will very well care for these, simply because bettering public schools will actually help these people, ladies and gentlemen, and help the government get more votes in return for actually providing services to these people. And ladies and gentlemen, we don't have to abolish private institutions to do this. We don't have to get rid of them, because the majority is already clearly inside the public. No, thank you. I'll take you in a second, madam. Because the public is already majorly inside these institutions. Yes, ma'am.
You were the ones who told us that public institutions are cricket. If your analysis of governments having an incentive to improve them actually works, why do you think they are cricket?
Well, madam, we don't think that they're cricket. In fact, if you say that these private institutions will in fact negatively affect public systems, you're wrong, because we've already told you that in fact the government will care for these people, and we've told you that in fact the private educations only help these public systems through the income tax that they give, ladies and gentlemen. But before that, to my next point, ladies and gentlemen, you're telling us that the best teachers are also in private schools, and that therefore we should actually take these teachers away from private schools and give them better teachers. But do you really think that you're going to be able to afford? No, thank you, sir. Do you think that you're going to be able to afford these people by actually giving mediocre salaries in mediocre schools, ladies and gentlemen? No, you're not, because the government won't be able to provide excessive payment to these students, to these profit-driven teachers, ladies and gentlemen, to the teachers connected to profit-driven institutions, and therefore, of course, they won't be able to afford as good teachers as private institutions would. So we're still telling you that the private institutions do in fact offer better education, and of course, when you take the private education students and put them into public schools, you're not even giving enough spaces to the actual less fortunate students, ladies and gentlemen, and you're cramming both the rich and the poor into the same area. Which brings my summary, ladies and gentlemen. We've told you, in fact, that the wealthy will still enter the top schools, whether they be public or private, ladies and gentlemen, simply because of the advantages they have of being wealthy, which we have explained thoroughly throughout all three speeches, ladies and gentlemen. So in other words, Team Proposition's idea that there will be a social equality is completely incorrect, because this does not actually support social equality, because it does not sustain social equality, simply because the rich still have major advantages. We've also told you that there still will be segregation, despite what Team Proposition thinks, because of the fact that these people will still be crammed into the same area, and because there will still be polarization between the rich and the poor. And we've also told you, in fact, that education in general, both for the poor and the more fortunate, ladies and gentlemen, will be of a decreased quality, because of the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that private institutions will be abolished, and because their tax revenues will not be enough, and because every student, both rich and poor, will be gathered into the same amassed classroom, ladies and gentlemen. And because of this, the educational values will decrease. And because of all of these points, please go with ALP.
Thank you very much. Now welcome Matt again to give the opposition reply.
Ladies and gentlemen, equality does not provide you any bread. Equality does not provide you with more education. We say principles are good. Principles are there to provide with happiness. But in this case, Madam Speaker, we do not necessarily have to back up principles, because in this case, principles are obviously is not able to provide with us happiness to begin with. In that case, Madam Speaker, we also agree with the principle that I have talked about, but this is not relevant to today's that match which side opposition has brought you up today. But more importantly, if we were to talk about the principle analysis, let's talk about our principle analysis that we have told you about. We have told you that, Madam Speaker, we already pay taxes. We already do something for the government. But, Madam Speaker, the government never can ever take my right to choose my money, how to spend my money, which was never refuted by side proposition, Madam Speaker. We believe it's a very strategically mistake. We believe the justification for this has to be proved by side proposition, but in order for you to prove this, you have to show us that it is legitimate for us as the government to spend away monies, and to restrict the rights of the people. And that's why, Madam Speaker, the principal clash is on sub-proposition to begin with. Now let's look at the second idea. Which case provides with more education? Firstly, we have told about the tax revenues. They told about this is not insignificant. Firstly, Madam Speaker, the billions of dollars, even the 20% of the billions of dollars is quite significant. Secondly, they told you about how this is a charity. Well, Madam Speaker, these are the minority cases. Raffles, Robert College, Columbia, all of these are not charities to begin with. More importantly, they talk about how the government never invests in public education. We told you that, Madam Speaker, yes, the public education is critical for a reason, because there is no budget to begin with. Not because of the officials. The officials have to invest in the public education because, Madam Speaker, these people obviously want to get elected for a second time. In order for you to do this, obviously you have to invest in the areas where the majority of the population gets from the services, not the minority. This is a very bad strategy for any party to begin with. Now let's look at the second idea about how they never touch our practical analysis, but our very simple refutations about how these are charity. Madam Speaker, in order for you to bring the analysis about the sub propositions, the proposition had to be direct in terms of rebuttal. We told you that the classrooms are going to be much worse. Technology is much worse. Worse teachers, because, Madam Speaker, much demotivated and stuff. No refutation or whatsoever, only in the case of teachers, which they have told that, Madam Speaker, the best teachers are going to the private education. Madam Speaker, but this is a logical fallacy. These people are the best teachers because they get the best money, Madam Speaker, because these people are demotivated, because they have incentivization, because they're not unhappy. In the case of public education, Madam Speaker, these people are very unhappy, very demotivated, and that's why they are significantly performing significantly worse than other cases, Madam Speaker, and that's why we're making the situation better. Now let's look at the third idea about how the regulations work, Madam Speaker. The case that side proposition I brought you today was not against private education, but it was against the corruptive system of private education, which is irrelevant to today's match, Madam Speaker. We told you that if regulations work, which will work if in the case of deterrency will be provided, if it does not work, then we will sincerely punish the people and such, Madam Speaker. We said that regulations can work, but more importantly, they have not presented the arguments against the private education, but against the corrupted system of education, which is irrelevant to today's match, and that's why, Madam Speaker, should not be brought up for this debate. And lastly, a clarification about the scholarships, like I have told you in my first speech. They have told about there's no incentives. Well, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, that is a lie. If you see a prodigy, a very talented and knowledge person in a public education, and if you give that person a scholarship, then obviously you have much more incentives, because if that person graduates from your college, firstly, a commercial, but more importantly, if that person becomes very successful, then obviously this person is going to invest in that college, which means this college is probably going to get much more revenues than the sub proposition is talking about. So, Madam Speaker, this match was about providing people, making people happier. When we say that, Madam Speaker, if we provided people with better education instead of equality, which does not do any good, which does not feed people, or else, Madam Speaker, the people are obviously going to be much more happier. That's why I go with up.
This debate was about two things, quality and quality. So let's look at quality. Now, what was the strategy proposed by Team Opposition to improve the quality of education? They proposed that we increase tax revenue. From the start, our refutation of this was clear. Sure, private schools may be profit-making entities, but they often masquerade as charities and gain tax-deductible status. On a factual basis alone, their side failed. But we didn't stop there, right? We went a step further to show how our side was the one that truly improved the quality of public education. We told you about how in the status quo, private schools amass huge amounts of resources and were able to attract top teaching talent away from the public sector. Time and again, they had no response. It was only in their third opposition that they told us that these teachers are great only because they are paid a lot. But that's precisely our case. We told you from the start of this debate that it's precisely private education that draws this talent away. Because fundamentally, a teacher is a teacher is a teacher, and if we make private education illegal, he or she will have no choice but to teach in the public sector, hence improving the quality of public education. We didn't stop there. We also told you that under our paradigm, politicians and policymakers who hail from the higher socio-economic strata had a greater incentive to improve the quality of public education because their sons, their brothers, and their children are the ones who are going to go into these corridors. What did they say in response? They told us about elections, but my third speaker already told them that elections were an insufficient mechanism because you don't win an election on public education. You win them on a whole range of other issues, and hence public education often gets neglected. And they truly believe that elections were so effective that clearly public schools wouldn't be crooked in their words. The next solution they brought to us under this theme of quality was the idea of regulation. And it was only in their third speaker that they tried to bring this naive portrait of how moderation to national standards will ensure that everything is okay. Yet, they did not all our analysis about the insidious network of regulatory capture. Sure, our governments may not be corrupt, but the fact of the matter is that the type of interpersonal relationships they are built as a result of the public sector attracting top curriculum experts into their ranks means that it's often impossible for regulators to clamp down on private schools. For all these reasons, it was our side that truly stood for the quality of education. So next, let's look at the idea of equality. And here, let me tell you this. I stay in a subsidized 3-room government flat back at home in Singapore. And even though I cannot chew gum, one thing I'm incredibly proud of hearing from my nation is that I go to Raffles Institution, one of my nation's top schools, but one that is state-funded by the government. And it's here that I find it morally abhorrent for team opposition to suggest that it's okay to perpetuate cycles of inequality, just so long as quality increases on aggregate. Because if the vast majority of people like me are unable to gain access to the better classrooms, the better facilities, and better extracurricular activities they talk about, then this increased inequality is meaningless. Even scholarships don't cut it. Because one thing I'm proud of is that I don't have to rely on charity and get bullied every single day of my life just to go to such a school. And even the last rally they made in their third opposition speaker about how public schools would still be desegregated, or rather segregated, did not quite gel with reality. When you have things like meritocratic systems, like public examinations, that ensured that even poor students had access to top institutions, as well as confidential school systems, where students went to their neighborhoods. For all these reasons, it was our team that truly stood for inequality. And that was why, from the start of this debate, we told you that it was justifiable to curtail the freedom they talk about, because public, or rather private education threatened the very foundations of our society.